The stars had never seemed so cold to Captain Deho as he stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge. His ship floated in the darkness of space, waiting. They were about to meet aliens for the first time in human history. It was the year 2287, and humanity had finally cracked faster-than-light travel. Now, they were no longer alone in the universe. Commander Hannah checked the sensors one more time. Her fingers moved across the controls with nervous energy. She had trained for this moment her entire life, but nothing could truly prepare someone for first contact. The entire crew held their breath as a massive alien ship appeared before them. It was beautiful, made of what looked like crystal and light. Ambassador Vorath materialized on their view screen. He was a being of pure crystalline structure, glowing with soft blue light. His species, the Luminae, were peaceful explorers who had been traveling the stars for thousands of years. He welcomed humanity to the Galactic Coalition with warm words and promises of friendship. The coalition was huge, spanning 12 arms of the galaxy. 847 different species living together in peace. Deho felt hope rising in his chest. Maybe humanity could finally leave behind its violent past. Maybe out here, among the stars, they could become something better. He smiled at Hannah, and she smiled back. This was the beginning of something wonderful. But that hope began to crack almost immediately. The coalition scientists came to study Earth, and their reports were disturbing. They classified Earth as a Class 12 death world. The gravity was too high. The weather was too violent. The diseases were too deadly. Even the oxygen levels were considered toxic to most species. Earth was a nightmare planet, and the fact that humans had survived there at all was considered remarkable. The other species looked at humans with pity. They saw survivors, not equals. They saw damaged creatures from a hostile world who needed protection and guidance. Deho tried to explain that humans were strong because of Earth, not despite it. But the aliens just nodded and smiled like adults, listening to a child's fantasy. 3 months after first contact, everything changed. The colony ship New Dawn was traveling to a new system that Earth had purchased from the Coalition. It carried 15,000 people, families with children, scientists, teachers, farmers. They were going to build a new world. Colony Director Ji-Wan commanded the ship, while Head of Security Tai Yang kept everyone safe. The system was supposed to be empty, but when the New Dawn arrived, they found ships already there. Warships. They belonged to the Vrin Collective, a species of aggressive reptilian beings who consider themselves the greatest warriors in the galaxy. The Vrin had decided they wanted that system, and they didn't care about human claims or coalition law. Tai Yang sent distress signals immediately. He tried to negotiate, to show their legal documents, to explain that the coalition had sold them this system. The Vrin didn't respond with words. They responded with weapons. The New Dawn's shields failed in the first volley. The second volley tore through the hull. 15,000 people died in less than 10 minutes. No survivors. No mercy. No warning. When Deho received the news, he felt something break inside him. He had spoken with Ji-Wan just days before. They had been friends at the academy. Ji-Wan had been so excited about the colony, about building something new. Now she was dead. They were all dead. 15,000 people, gone. He contacted the Galactic Coalition immediately, expecting swift justice. Ambassador Vorath appeared on his screen, and Deho could see genuine sadness in the alien's crystalline features. Vorath promised a thorough investigation. He said the council would look into the matter. He said justice would be served. But when Deho asked when that justice would come, Vorath hesitated. The investigation could take years, he admitted. The Vrin were a powerful member species of the Coalition. Direct action against them could destabilize the entire galactic government. There were procedures to follow, committees to consult, diplomatic channels to navigate. Deho couldn't believe what he was hearing. 15,000 humans had been murdered, and the galaxy's response was paperwork. He demanded to speak with the High Council directly. Vorath arranged it. Though he warned Deho that the council rarely changed their decisions, the council meeting was worse than Deho had imagined. The chamber was vast and filled with representatives from hundreds of species. Council Arbiter the Shan, an ancient being who had lived for over 3,000 years, listened to Deho's testimony with what appeared to be boredom. When he finished, she spoke in a voice like wind chimes. The Vrin would be given a formal censure, she announced. Economic sanctions might be considered. The incident was regrettable, but direct military action was not how civilized species handled disputes. The coalition had maintained peace for over 3 millennia through diplomacy and patience. Humanity would need to learn these values if they wished to be part of galactic civilization. Deho stood there in shock. A censure, a piece of paper and a strongly worded letter, that was the price of 15,000 human lives. He looked at the hundreds of alien faces around him, and he saw the truth. They didn't care. They couldn't care. They had lived in peace for so long that they had forgotten what justice actually meant. He returned to Earth and reported directly to President Minho. The president listened to everything in silence, his face growing harder with each word. When Deho finished, Minho called an emergency session of the United Earth government. Every major leader, military commander, and civilian official gathered in one room. Fleet Admiral Sora attended, along with General Ji-hoon. They had both reviewed the tactical data from the New Dawn's final moments. The Vrin hadn't even tried to disable the ship. They had gone straight for lethal force. It was murder, pure and simple, and the galaxy was going to do nothing about it. The debate lasted for hours. Some argued for patience, for working within the coalition system. Others wanted immediate action but worried about humanity's ability to fight an entire galactic civilization. The humans were newcomers with barely 200 military ships. The Vrin alone had 12,000 warships, but President Minho understood something that the rest of the galaxy had forgotten. Justice delayed was justice denied. 15,000 people deserved better than empty promises and bureaucratic investigations. Their families deserved to know that their deaths meant something. He stood before the assembly and made his decision clear. If the coalition would not deliver justice, then humanity would deliver it themselves. They would give the Vrin one chance to surrender those responsible and pay for their crimes. If the Vrin refused, then Earth would go to war. The room erupted in arguments, but Minho's voice cut through the noise like a blade. He wasn't asking for permission. He was informing them of what was going to happen. Humanity had survived on a death world by never backing down from threats. They had learned that predators only respected strength. The Vrin were predators. Admiral Sora stepped forward and asked a simple question. If they did this, if they actually went to war with a coalition species, there would be no going back. The entire galaxy might turn against humanity. Was the president prepared for that consequence? Minho looked at her with eyes of steel. 15,000 people had died because the galaxy was too comfortable, too safe, too willing to ignore injustice for the sake of stability. If humanity had to stand alone to prove that some lines could never be crossed, then they would stand alone. The vote was called. It passed overwhelmingly. Earth was going to war. The message went out across every communication channel in the galaxy. President Minho's face appeared on screens from one end of the coalition to the other, and his words were simple and direct. The Vrin Collective had 72 hours to surrender those responsible for the destruction of the New Dawn. They had 72 hours to pay reparations to the families of the 15,000 dead. If they refused, humanity would consider it an act of war. The galaxy's reaction was immediate. On 1,000 worlds, people laughed. On the Coalition High Council station, ambassadors couldn't believe what they were hearing. War? Actual war? The concept seemed almost quaint, like something from ancient history books. The coalition had maintained peace for over 3,000 years through careful diplomacy and economic pressure. Real wars simply didn't happen anymore. Ambassador Voroth tried to warn his colleagues. He had studied humans more carefully than most, and he saw something in their history that worried him. Humans had been fighting wars on their death world for their entire existence. They had refined warfare into a science, an art, a fundamental part of their culture. But when he tried to explain this to the council, he dismissed his concerns. Council Arbiter Thessian stood before the assembled delegates and addressed the human threat with open mockery. Humanity had perhaps 200 ships, she pointed out. Most of those were converted exploration vessels and mining platforms. The Vryn Collective alone possessed 12,000 dedicated warships with shields that could withstand sustained bombardment and energy weapons capable of destroying planets. The idea that humans posed any real military threat was absurd. She called humans children throwing a tantrum. Primitives from a savage world who would learn that civilization was built on patience and wisdom, not violence and anger. The council chamber filled with agreement. Even the species that felt sympathy for humanity's loss thought the war declaration was suicide. Better to accept the investigation process and trust in coalition justice, however slow it might be, in Vin space. War leader Corvus received the human ultimatum and nearly fell from his command throne with laughter. His officers joined in, their harsh, reptilian voices echoing through the command center. Humans threatening the Vryn. It was the best joke they had heard in decades. Corvus ordered the message displayed on public screens across all Vryn worlds so his people could share in the amusement. The Vryn were proud warriors, the apex predators of their homeworld who had conquered 6 star systems before joining the coalition. They maintained the largest military fleet of any single species specifically because they believed in strength. The idea that soft, weak humans from their ridiculously dangerous planet could challenge Vryn military might was hilarious. Corvus sent back a response that was broadcast across the galaxy. The Vryn acknowledged receipt of the human message, he announced. They rejected all accusations and all demands. If humanity wanted war, the Vryn would be happy to educate them in the realities of galactic power. He gave humans 72 hours to withdraw their threat and apologize, or the Vryn would visit Earth and teach them proper respect. But while the galaxy laughed and mocked, something very different was happening in Earth's orbital shipyards. Fleet Admiral Sora moved through the command center like a force of nature, issuing orders with crisp precision. Around her, the shipyards hummed with activity that had never been seen before in human history. Vice Admiral Yunwu commanded the First Strike Fleet, and he was busy converting every available ship into a weapon of war. Exploration vessels had their science labs stripped out and replaced with missile batteries. Mining ships designed to break asteroids were being loaded with kinetic kill vehicles. Even civilian transports were being retrofitted with basic weapons and armor. Rear Admiral Yunji led the stealth division, and her work was perhaps the most crucial. She had studied coalition military technology carefully, and she had noticed something interesting. Every coalition ship used energy shields and directed energy weapons. Their entire military doctrine was built around technologies that produced massive energy signatures. They could see each other coming from light years away. Human ships didn't have that limitation. Human technology was more primitive, yes, but that meant it was also harder to detect. A ship with no shields, running on minimal power, using ballistic weapons instead of energy beams would be nearly invisible to coalition sensors. Yanji was building a ghost fleet. Commodore Dong Yun oversaw weapons development, and he was having the time of his life. The coalition had centuries of peace, which meant their weapons technology had stagnated. They built shields to stop energy weapons because that's what everyone used. But humans had spent thousands of years figuring out how to kill each other. They had gotten very good at it. Railguns that fired solid projectiles at a fraction of light speed. Nuclear missiles that didn't care about shields. Kinetic kill vehicles that were just chunks of metal moving really fast. Even simple explosive rounds, none of it was elegant or advanced. Dong Yun's calculations showed it would all punch straight through coalition. Shields like they weren't even there. The real genius was in the tactics. Captain Deho had been promoted to commander of the battlecruiser Defiant, and he worked with Admiral Sora to develop the battle plan. Coalition military doctrine assumed both sides would follow rules of engagement. Ships would maintain certain distances, communicate intentions, allow for retreats and surrenders. Battle was ritualized, almost ceremonial. Humans weren't going to follow any of those rules. Why would they? The Vryn hadn't followed rules when they massacred the New Dawn. No warnings, no negotiations, just immediate lethal force. Humanity would return the favor. The 72-hour deadline approached. In the Coalition Council chambers, last-minute attempts at diplomacy failed. Vorath pleaded with President Minho to reconsider, to give the investigation process more time. Minho's response was cold and final. 15,000 people didn't have more time. Justice delayed was justice denied. On Vryn Prime, war leader Corvus assembled his fleet in orbit as a show of strength. 12,000 warships, the pride of the Vryn military, arranged in perfect formation. Every major news network in the galaxy sent cameras to record what they expected to be humanity's humiliation. This would be the moment the primitive Deathworlders learned their place in civilized space. The deadline expired at exactly midnight. Earth Standard Time. For several minutes, nothing happened. The galaxy watched the feeds from Vryn Prime, waiting. Some species felt nervous. Most felt curious. A few, like Vorath, felt dread. Then Admiral Sora gave the order that would change galactic history forever. Her message went out to every human ship, every human station, every human colony. It was simple and direct, just for words that carried the weight of humanity's rage and determination. Weapons free. Show them. 200 human ships entered FTL, heading directly for Vryn space. They weren't following standard jump protocols. They weren't announcing their arrival. They weren't hailing for negotiations. They were coming in hot, weapons armed, crews at battle stations, ready to teach the galaxy what Deathworlders learned from surviving on a planet that tried to kill them every single day. On Earth, President Minho stood in the war room, surrounded by his advisors and military commanders. General Jihoon pulled up tactical displays showing the fleet's progress. They would arrive at Vryn Prime in approximately 6 hours. The Vryn would have plenty of time to scramble their defenses, but Minho wasn't worried about the Vryn being ready. In fact, he was counting on it. The galaxy needed to see this. They needed to understand that humanity wasn't making empty threats. When humans declared war, they meant it. When humans demanded justice, they would take it by force if necessary. Across the galaxy, billions of beings tuned in to watch the feeds from Vryn Prime. It would be the most watched event in galactic history. Entertainment networks offered commentary from military experts, who explained exactly how quickly the humans would be defeated. Betting markets took wagers on how many minutes the battle would last. The consensus was somewhere between 5 and 20 minutes before human forces either retreated or were destroyed. No one, not even Vorath, who knew humans better than most, understood what was really about to happen. The galaxy had forgotten what war actually meant. They had forgotten what happened when you pushed predators into a corner. They had forgotten that peaceful civilizations were built on the bones of warriors who made peace possible. They were about to remember. The Deathworlders were coming, and the galaxy was going to freeze in terror. The Battle of Vryn Prime began in a way that made absolutely no sense to anyone watching. Vice Admiral Han Wu's first strike fleet emerged from FTL not at the edge of the system where ships normally appeared, but scattered across dozens of entry points all around Vryn Prime itself. They came in already moving at combat speed, already in attack formation, already firing. There was no hailing, no demands for surrender, no ritualized maneuvering for position. The humans simply appeared and started destroying things. The Vryn fleet, arranged in their perfect parade formation around the planet, scrambled to respond. But they were too slow, too confused, too unprepared for an enemy that didn't follow any known rules of warfare. Commander Yuna's destroyer, Hurricane, screamed past a Vryn battlecruiser at point-blank range and launched. Every missile it carried in a single massive volley. The Vryn shields lit up, designed to absorb and dissipate energy weapons. They did absolutely nothing against physical projectiles filled with high explosives. 16 missiles punched through the shields like they weren't there, and tore the battlecruiser into glowing debris. On the Defiant, Captain Deho coordinated the assault with cold precision. He felt no joy in this, no satisfaction. Just a grim determination to make the Vryn pay for what they had done. His weapons officer called out targets, and the Defiant's railguns spoke with thunder. Solid metal slugs, accelerated to tremendous speeds, crossed the distance in seconds and ripped through Vryn armor like paper. The Vryn tried to return fire with their energy weapons, beautiful beams of concentrated light that could burn through most materials. But human ships were small and fast, dancing through space in ways that the larger, more stable coalition vessels couldn't match. And when the beams did connect, they found that human armor was designed for a different kind of war. Ablative plates absorbed and dispersed the energy. Reactive armor exploded outward to deflect beams. Redundant systems meant one hit didn't cripple a ship. War leader Corvus couldn't believe what he was seeing on his displays. His fleet was being torn apart by primitive ships using primitive weapons. How was this possible? The humans shouldn't have been able to penetrate Vryn shields. They shouldn't have been able to move that fast. They shouldn't have been fighting like this at all. He tried to rally his forces to organize a proper counterattack. But the humans weren't giving him time. They weren't following any predictable pattern. Some ships attacked directly. Others hung back and launched long-range missiles. A few simply ran dark, appearing on sensors only when they fired, then vanishing again into the black dot. Then Commander Yuna did something that would be talked about for generations. Her ship had taken heavy damage in the initial assault. Life support was failing. Weapons were offline. By all reasonable military doctrine, she should have ordered evacuation and retreat. Instead, she did the math in her head and saw an opportunity. The Hurricane still had engines, still had mass, still had velocity. Yuna gave her crew 30 seconds to reach the escape pods. Then she locked herself on the bridge and pointed her dying ship directly at a Vryn dreadnought. The massive warship tried to evade, but it was too big, too slow. The Hurricane hit it at nearly maximum velocity. The collision was spectacular. Both ships were destroyed instantly, transformed into an expanding cloud of superheated debris. But the psychological impact was devastating. The humans were willing to die to win. Not as a last resort, not in desperation, but as a deliberate tactical choice. What kind of species did that? What kind of warriors chose death so easily if it meant taking the enemy with them? While the main fleet kept the Vryn occupied, Rear Admiral Yunji's stealth division was executing their own mission. Her ships, running silent with no shields and minimal power, had slipped past the Vryn defensive perimeter undetected. They positioned themselves around Vryn Prime's orbital stations and defense platforms. Then they struck all at once. Boarding pods launched from the stealth ships, carrying human marines in full combat armor. Sergeant Kyung led one of the assault teams, and they hit a Vryn command station with overwhelming force. The Vryn defenders had never experienced close-quarters combat against humans before. They had no idea what they were facing. Humans were stronger than they looked, faster than they should be, and completely unbothered by the station's gravity or environmental conditions. Kung's team moved through the corridors like they owned them, clearing room after room with brutal efficiency. Within 20 minutes, they had captured the entire command station and seized the surrender codes for half the Vryn orbital defense grid. Captain Salman commanded the orbital support ship Vigilance, and her job was perhaps the most difficult. From high above the battle, she coordinated strike packages against Vryn military installations on the planet below. Intelligence had identified 17 major bases, 42 weapons factories, and 6 command centers that needed to be neutralized. The problem was that the Vryn, realizing they were losing, had started moving military assets into civilian areas. Weapons platforms positioned next to schools. Command centers hidden in residential districts. It was a desperate attempt to force the humans to either accept collateral damage or stop their assault. Salman contacted General Ji-hoon back on Earth, who patched in President Minho. This was the moment that would define what kind of war humanity was fighting. Would they accept civilian casualties to achieve military objectives? Or would they let the Vryn hide behind innocence? Minho's answer was clear. They would not become monsters to fight monsters. Surgical strikes only. Precision weapons. If it meant the operation took longer, so be it. Humanity would prove they were better than this. They would show the galaxy that even in war, there were lines that should never be crossed. Salman adjusted her strike packages accordingly. Instead of orbital bombardment, she sent in special forces teams to extract civilians before hitting military targets. Instead of heavy weapons, She used precision-guided munitions that could thread through a window. It was harder, slower, and riskier for human forces. But it was the right thing to do. The Battle of Vryn Prime lasted 16 hours. By the end, 3/4 of the Vryn fleet had been destroyed or disabled. Human casualties were surprisingly light, considering they had attacked a force that outnumbered them 60-1. The key had been understanding that superior numbers meant nothing if your enemy refused to fight the way you expected. War leader Corvus sat in his command center, surrounded by disaster. His proud fleet was debris. His orbital defenses were captured. Human ships controlled the space around his homeworld. And when the humans finally hailed him, and Captain Deho's face appeared on his screen, Corvus felt something he had never experienced before. Fear. Deho's terms were simple. Unconditional surrender. The individuals who gave the order to destroy the New Dawn would be handed over for trial on Earth. Reparations would be paid to every victim's family. The Vryn military would be reduced by half and placed under coalition supervision. And the Vryn would publicly acknowledge their crime and apologize. Corvus wanted to refuse, wanted to fight to the last. But he looked at the faces of his surviving officers and saw the truth. The humans had broken them. Not just militarily, but psychologically. The Vryn had thought themselves the greatest warriors in the galaxy. Now they knew they weren't even close. He surrendered. Major Sung led a Marine detachment to occupy Vryn High Command. And they did it with the same precision and discipline they had shown throughout the battle. They didn't loot or destroy. They didn't abuse prisoners. They simply secured the area and established order. It was almost worse than brutality would have been, because it showed how completely the humans controlled the situation. The galaxy watched all of this in stunned silence. Every news network, every military academy, every government chamber saw the same thing. The humans had fought a major coalition power and won decisively. But more importantly, they had fought with both overwhelming force and careful restraint. They had proven they could destroy, but chose to limit that destruction. They could have killed millions of Vryn civilians. They chose not to. In the Coalition Council chambers, Council Arbiter Thession stared at the reports with shaking hands. She had mocked the humans, called them children, dismissed their threats. Now she had to face the fact that humanity had just rewritten galactic military doctrine in a single battle. Ambassador. Vorath addressed the emergency council session that convened immediately after the battle. His message was simple and terrifying. The humans hadn't even used their full fleet for this operation. This was a demonstration, a warning. Humanity had approximately 200 military vessels. They had deployed less than half of them to destroy the Vryn fleet. The council members looked at each other with dawning horror. If this was humanity fighting carefully, fighting with restraint, fighting while limiting civilian casualties, what would happen if they ever decided to fight without limits? What would happen if they brought their full military might to bear? But Vorath saw something else in the battle reports, something that gave him hope. Yes, the humans were terrifyingly effective warriors, but they had also shown honor, shown restraint, shown that they understood the difference between justice and revenge. They had the power to destroy Vryn Prime completely. They chose not to. That choice, Vorath realized, was the most important thing about the entire battle. The galaxy hadn't just learned that humans were dangerous. They had learned that humans were dangerous but principled. They would wage war when necessary, but they wouldn't abandon their ethics to do it. The galaxy was freezing in fear, yes. But maybe, just maybe, they were also beginning to understand what humanity had been trying to tell them all along. Peace wasn't just the absence of conflict. It was the presence of justice. And sometimes, justice required warriors willing to enforce it. The aftermath of Vryn Prime sent shockwaves through every corner of the galaxy. On Vryn Prime itself, Captain Deho supervised the transition of power, while Governor Nari worked to establish a temporary human administration. The Vryn population expected brutal occupation forces, the kind they themselves would have deployed. Instead, they got human aid workers rebuilding damaged infrastructure and human doctors treating wounded Vryn soldiers. Lieutenant Borum served as a military liaison, and she found herself explaining human concepts to confused Vryn civilians almost daily. An elderly Vryn female approached her one day outside a medical station and asked a simple question. Why were humans helping them? The Vryn had destroyed a human colony. They deserved revenge, deserved punishment, deserved to see their cities burned. Borum looked at the old female and gave her an answer that would spread across Vryn Prime like wildfire. Humanity didn't come here to destroy a civilization. They came to ensure this never happened again. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about making things right and preventing future wrongs. The Vryn who ordered the attack on the New Dawn would face trial. But the regular Vryn people, the civilians, the children, they had done nothing wrong. Back on Earth, President Minho faced a different kind of battle. The victory at Vryn Prime had made humanity important, and importance brought complexity. Senator Murray led a faction demanding that humans press their advantage. The galaxy feared them now. They should use that fear to reshape galactic civilization according to human values. To take a leadership role by force if necessary. Ambassador Yemen argued the opposite. He pushed for reconciliation with the coalition, for using the victory as a bargaining chip to achieve peaceful reform rather than forced change. The galaxy was afraid, yes, but fear could turn to hatred. If humanity pushed too hard, they might find themselves facing not one enemy, but hundreds. The debates in the government chambers grew heated. Some wanted to expand human military power to ensure no one could ever threaten Earth again. Others worried that becoming a military power would turn humanity into the very thing they had fought against. They had proven their point. Now, they needed to figure out what came next. Fleet Admiral Sora called a meeting of her senior command staff. Vice Admiral Hunhua brought disturbing intelligence reports. 17 coalition species had begun military buildups in response to the Battle of Vryn Prime. They claimed it was purely defensive, but the pattern was clear. They were preparing for a possible conflict with humanity re-air. Admiral Yunji's reconnaissance division had uncovered something even more concerning. 3 major galactic powers, the Keltorian Unity, the Praxis Confederacy, and the Thorian Empire, were in secret communications. They were discussing the human problem and how to contain it. The word preemptive appeared in several intercepted messages. Sora looked at the tactical displays, showing potential threat vectors, and felt a cold weight settle in her chest. Humanity had won the battle, but they might have started a war they couldn't finish. They had shown the galaxy they were dangerous. Now the galaxy was deciding whether humans were too dangerous to allow to exist. She requested an immediate meeting with President Minho. In the secure conference room, surrounded by the highest levels of Earth's leadership, she laid out the harsh truth. Humanity could win battles. They had proven that. But a prolonged war against half the galaxy would end in human extinction, no matter how good Earth's military was. Numbers mattered. Resources mattered. And right now, the math didn't look good. General Ji-hoon argued for a defensive posture. Pull back human forces, fortify the solar system, make any attack on Earth so costly that no one would attempt it. Let the galaxy see that humans wanted peace, but were prepared for war. It was a reasonable strategy. But it left the initiative to potential enemies. On the Coalition High Council station, political earthquake was occurring. Council Arbiter Thession faced a vote of no confidence led by Younger. Council members who had watched her dismissive attitude toward humanity backfire spectacularly. Councillor Veridex, a rising political figure, stood before the assembly and delivered a speech that challenged 3,000 years of coalition doctrine. The coalition had become weak. Not militarily weak, but morally weak. They had confused peace with inaction, diplomacy with cowardice. When the Vryn massacred 15,000 humans, the coalition's response had been to investigate, to wait, to hope the problem would resolve itself peacefully. That wasn't peace. That was simply looking away from injustice, because confronting it was uncomfortable. Humanity, Veridax continued, had shown what real civilization looked like. They had the power to destroy Vryn Prime completely. Instead, they had fought with precision and restraint, punishing the guilty while protecting the innocent. They had demonstrated that being good at war didn't mean glorifying it. It meant having the strength to enforce justice when justice was denied. Ambassador Vorath supported Veridax's position, explaining to skeptical council members that humans operated under something called the laws of war. These were rules that humanity imposed on itself too. Limit violence, even in the midst of total conflict. The concept was completely alien to most coalition species. Either you fought to total destruction, or you didn't fight at all. This middle ground, this idea of controlled violence, didn't fit into their understanding. But it was exactly that middle ground that made humans so dangerous and so valuable. They could wage war without losing their humanity. They could fight without becoming monsters. The question was whether the rest of the galaxy would see this as an opportunity to learn, or a threat to eliminate. The answer came sooner than anyone expected. The Keltorian Unity, Praxis Confederacy, and Thorian Empire announced the formation of a defensive alliance specifically designed to contain human expansion. They called it the Stability Coalition, and they issued an ultimatum that was broadcast across every channel in the galaxy. Humanity must submit to coalition oversight. They must limit their military to purely defensive forces. They must accept permanent monitoring of their weapons development and ship production. They must agree never to intervene in coalition affairs without council approval. If humanity refused these terms, Stability Coalition would consider it an act of aggression and respond accordingly. President Minho read the ultimatum in silence, his face unreadable. Around him, his advisors erupted in angry objections. They were being told to surrender their sovereignty, to become a client state of the coalition. All because they had dared to seek justice for 15,000 murdered civilians. Captain Chanwu, of the science vessel Discovery, was monitoring coalition fleet movements when he intercepted communications that made his blood run cold. The Stability Coalition wasn't just making threats. They were positioning a massive fleet, over 30,000 ships combined, for a coordinated strike on Earth's solar system. The attack was planned for 1 week from now. He forwarded the intelligence to Admiral Sora immediately. She stared at the tactical projections and understood the impossible choice before her. Launch a preemptive strike against 3 galactic powers based on intercepted intelligence, or wait for them to attack humanity's homeworld. The military leadership gathered again in the war room. General Jihoon advocated for immediate action. Take out their fleet while it was still assembling. Hit them hard and fast, the same way they had hit the Vryn. Show the galaxy that threatening Earth was suicide. It was tactically sound. But strategically it would confirm every fear the galaxy had about human aggression. Ambassador Yemen begged for one more diplomatic solution. There had to be species in the coalition who didn't want this war. Younger civilizations who were tired of the old order. If humanity could find allies, show that this wasn't about humans versus the galaxy, maybe the situation could be resolved peacefully. Fleet Admiral Sora presented the cold mathematics. Even with a preemptive strike, even with all of Earth's tactical advantages, a war against the Stability Coalition would be brutal. Human casualties would be massive, and win or lose. It would poison Earth's relationship with the rest of the galaxy for generations. The debate was interrupted by Colonel Sunhee, head of human intelligence. She had been quietly working on her own investigation, and she had found something important. Not every coalition species supported the Stability Coalition. In fact, dozens of smaller species were privately reaching out to human diplomatic channels, expressing concerns about the ultimatum. These species had their own grievances with the coalition power structure. They had seen injustices ignored, seen their concerns dismissed, seen the big powers do whatever they wanted, while the little ones were told to be patient. Humanity's victory over the Vryn had given them hope that maybe things could change. Sunhee proposed a different strategy. Instead of fighting the Stability Coalition, instead of trying to reform the coalition from within, humanity should offer the galaxy something it claimed to want but had forgotten how to achieve: real justice, real security, real enforcement of laws rather than empty promises. President Minho listened to her plan and saw the brilliance in it. It was risky, perhaps even more risky than war, but it offered something war couldn't: a future where humanity wasn't standing alone against the galaxy, but standing with parts of the galaxy against a corrupt system. He made his decision. Instead of mobilizing for war, instead of launching preemptive strikes, humanity would broadcast a message to every species in the coalition. They would acknowledge their violent nature, explain why Deathworlders fought differently, and make an offer that would reshape galactic civilization. Humanity would share its military doctrine, its defensive technology, its strategic knowledge, with any species willing to build a new coalition, not based on comfortable bureaucracy, but on actual enforcement of justice. Not reactive and slow, but proactive and swift. A coalition that would protect the weak instead of just feeling sorry for them. The message went out. The Stability Coalition fleet continued moving toward Earth and across the galaxy. Millions of beings watched to see what would happen next. Would humanity stand and fight? Would they surrender? Or would they do something no one expected? Ambassador Vorath stood before the Coalition Council with a proposal that would change everything. It was radical, revolutionary, and possibly insane. But watching the humans had taught him something important. Sometimes the only way to fix a broken system was to break it further and rebuild from the pieces. The galaxy held its breath and waited. The Coalition high. Council chambers had never been so crowded or so tense. Ambassador Vorath stood at the center, and beside him stood representatives from 43 smaller coalition species who had signed something they called the Accord of Enforcement. It was a complete restructuring of how galactic law would work, replacing the coalition's slow, reactive justice system with something that would actively protect the innocent council. Arbiter the Shen tried to maintain control of the proceedings, but her authority was crumbling. Too many species had watched the Vryn massacre go unpunished, had seen humanity forced to seek justice alone, and had realized the system was fundamentally broken. The coalition wasn't keeping peace. It was just avoiding conflict by looking away from injustice. Veridax presented the core argument with passionate clarity. For 3,000 years, the coalition had operated on a simple principle: talk first, talk more, keep talking, and eventually problems would resolve themselves. But that only worked when all parties operated in good faith. The Vryn hadn't operated in good faith. They had murdered 15,000 civilians and expected to face nothing worse than a strongly worded letter. The debate became heated as representatives realized this wasn't really about humanity anymore. It was about whether the galaxy would continue prioritizing comfortable stability over actual justice. The older, more powerful species argued for maintaining the system. The younger, weaker species argued for change. The council was splitting down the middle. While politicians argued, something more immediate was happening in space. The Stability Coalition fleet, 30,000 warships strong, entered the Sol system's outer reaches. It was a terrifying sight, enough firepower to reduce Earth to radioactive dust. Keltorian Admiral Thorax commanded the combined fleet, and he expected the humans to either flee or surrender. Fleet Admiral Sora deployed Earth's defensive grid. Every ship, every station, every weapon platform humanity possessed. It wasn't enough. Not even close. The math was simple and brutal. Humanity could win individual battles through tactics and surprise. But this wasn't a battle. This was an overwhelming force come to impose its will. But Sora had prepared something else. Something that had nothing to do with weapons or tactics. Captain Deho, aboard the Defiant, led a small diplomatic ship directly toward the Stability Coalition fleet. With him were Captain Chenwu, Commander Yuna, who had survived her collision with the Vryn dreadnought by ejecting at the last second, and Ambassador Yemen. The ship was unarmed and running with shields down. Deho broadcast on all channels, his message reaching not just the fleet, but every news network in the galaxy. Humanity wasn't here to fight, he announced. They were here to show the galaxy what they had forgotten, what it actually meant to be civilized, to fight for justice, to protect the innocent even at great cost. He uploaded something that had been prepared over weeks by human scholars and historians. A complete archive of human history, every war, every peace treaty, every atrocity, and every act of heroism. It was brutal and unflinching, hiding nothing of humanity's violent past. But it also showed something the galaxy had lost: the evolution of warfare from total destruction to rules and limits. From mindless violence to principled combat, Lieutenant Borum provided commentary that spread across galactic networks faster than anything in recent history. She explained the Geneva Convention's rules humanity had created to protect the innocent during war. She showed how humans had developed war crimes tribunals after their most devastating conflicts. She demonstrated that being good at war didn't mean glorifying it. It meant understanding it well enough to limit it. On Vryn Prime, Governor Nari had completed her mission. The occupation was ending, not because humans were being driven out, but because they were choosing to leave. A reformed Vryn government, led by Solara, who had opposed the New Dawn massacre from the beginning, was ready to take control. Human and Vryn representatives held a joint memorial service for all casualties, both human colonists and Vryn soldiers. Sergeant Kyung's Marine platoon stood honor guard alongside reformed Vryn peacekeepers. It was a powerful image that broadcast across the galaxy. Yesterday's enemies standing together, not because they forgot what had happened, but because they had achieved justice and were ready to move forward. Back at the Coalition Council, the vote on the Accord of Enforcement reached its climax. Councillor Veridex gave a final speech that would be remembered for generations. The Coalition had confused peace with inaction, he said. They had believed that avoiding conflict was the same as promoting justice. But humanity had shown them the truth. Real peace required the courage to confront injustice, even when confrontation was difficult. The vote was called. Species after species cast their decision. The older powers mostly voted against, wanting to maintain the comfortable system they knew, but the younger species, the smaller ones, the ones who had been ignored for centuries, they voted for change. The accord passed by a narrow margin. The Coalition, as they knew it, was dead. Something new was being born in space near Earth. Admiral Thorex of the Stability Coalition watched the historical archive, saw humanity's capacity for both terrible violence and remarkable mercy, and understood something important. The humans weren't the threat here. The real threat was a galaxy that had become so comfortable it had forgotten how to stand for anything. He contacted Fleet Admiral Sora directly. His message simple. The Stability Coalition had come to contain a threat, he said, but they had found something else. They had found a reminder of what they had lost. The courage to defend principles, the strength to enforce justice, the wisdom to know when to fight and when to show mercy. Thorex ordered his fleet to power down weapons. The other Stability Coalition commanders followed his lead. They hadn't surrendered. They had simply recognized that they were pointing weapons at the wrong target. If anyone needed to be contained, it was the old Coalition system that had allowed the Vryn massacre to happen in the first place. President Minho addressed both Earth and the galaxy in a broadcast. That would define humanity's place among the stars. Earth would join what they were calling the New Coalition, he announced. Not as conquerors, not as rulers, but as partners. Humanity would share its military expertise, but only with species committed to using force in defense of justice. Never aggression. The galaxy had called humans Deathworlders, Minho said, as if it was a weakness or a shame. But humans had learned something on their harsh world that comfortable species had forgotten. Civilization wasn't built on avoiding conflict. It was built on knowing what was worth fighting for, and having the courage to fight for it when necessary. 1 year later, the galaxy had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible before the Battle of Vryn Prime. Admiral Sora had retired from active military service and now ran the Coalition Defense Academy, training mixed-species units in human military doctrine. Her students came from 100 different worlds, learning not just tactics and weapons, but the ethics that made those tools acceptable to use. Vice Admiral Hune commanded the new Coalition Rapid Response Fleet, a multinational force that could deploy within hours to prevent atrocities. They had intervened in 6 potential conflicts in the past year, and in each case, the mere presence of a force willing and able to act had been enough to stop violence before it started. Captain Deho served as humanity's representative on the new Coalition Council, working alongside Ambassador Vorath, who had become his closest friend and ally. Together they navigated the complex politics of a galaxy, learning that peace required more than just hoping for the best. It required being prepared to enforce justice when necessary. The old power structure still existed, still argued for the old ways, but they were losing influence. Younger species that had been ignored for generations now had defensive capabilities that made larger powers think twice. The concept of enforceable justice had replaced the old model of endless negotiation that led nowhere. On Earth, Colonel Sun He visited the memorial for the New Dawn victims. It was a quiet place, a garden with 15,000 stones, each one carved with a name. She walked among them slowly, reading the names, remembering why all of this had started. Director Ji Wan, Security Chief Tai Young, and 13,998 others who had died simply because they were human and someone thought humans didn't matter. She met a young woman there, someone visiting her father's stone. Her name was Minji, and she had been only 5 years old when her father died aboard the New Dawn. Now she was grown, working in the human diplomatic corps, helping to build the better galaxy her father had dreamed of. Your father would be proud, Sun He told her quietly. 15,000 people died, but their deaths meant something. The galaxy will never ignore an injustice like that again. Minji touched her father's stone gently and nodded. It didn't make the loss hurt any less, but it gave it meaning. Her father hadn't died because the galaxy was cruel. He had died because the galaxy was comfortable and lazy, and his death, along with all the others, had made the galaxy wake up and remember what civilization actually required in the Coalition Council chambers. A new holographic display had been installed. It showed a quote from President Minho's historic speech, the one that had challenged the galaxy's understanding of peace and justice. Humans had insisted it be displayed there, and after everything that had happened, no one had argued. The quote was simple, but powerful. You call us Deathworlders as if it's a weakness. But we learned something on our harsh world that you forgot in your comfortable ones. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of justice. And justice sometimes requires good people willing to fight for it. Millions of beings passed that quote every day. Some agreed with it. Some still argued against it. But none of them could ignore it. The humans had forced the galaxy to confront an uncomfortable truth. Being civilized didn't mean avoiding violence at all costs. It meant knowing when violence was necessary to protect the innocent, and having the courage to use it when that moment came. Humanity's role in the galaxy had transformed completely. They were no longer the newcomers, the primitives from a death world, who didn't understand how things worked. They were the species that taught the galaxy what it had forgotten. That civilization required not just laws, but the willingness to enforce those laws. Not just principles, but the courage to defend those principles. Not just peace, but justice. The galaxy watched. The galaxy learned. And the galaxy, for perhaps the first time in 3,000 years, understood what it truly meant to stand for something, rather than just talking about it. The Deathworlders had declared war, and in doing so, it taught the galaxy how to build real peace. The stars were no longer cold to those who looked up at them. They were full of possibility, full of hope, full of the knowledge that justice was possible if people were brave enough to fight for it. Humanity had shown the way. Now it was up to the galaxy to follow.